Hello, and welcome to the second presentation on Bless Me Ultima. A little shorter this week, again, because we're not introducing a new book, so there's a little bit less to cover before we jump into the chapters. I'm going to organize this week's presentation around just really doing some close reading of some passages that come up through the course of the last half of the novel. I'm not really going to offer much of a plot summary or anything like that. Um, but I want to focus on some passages, point out how they relate to some of the themes we're interested in, and in some cases, I'll give you some of my thoughts. In other cases, I'll just ask you to consider them in light of the discussions that we've had. So, in chapter, what would that be? Trace um, 13? Um, we get this passage. Perhaps that is why God could not forgive. He was too much like a man. And what I want you to think about with this passage, religion obviously is hugely important in this novel. It becomes even more important as time goes on. In the second half that you read for this week, we get the long, extended passage leading up to confirmation and First Communion, and also First Confession is in there. Um, but in looking at sort of how God and how religion are perceived in this novel, we get this passage, and I want you to consider it in as much as it relates to gender roles. In other words, um, how masculinity and femininity are viewed in this novel and specifically, uh, as well as in our culture more broadly, but also in rural culture. Um, you know, this is a novel that largely contains men and women in traditional gender roles. Antonio's father goes out and works. Tenorio, as the bad guy, is the sort of male villain with the twirling mustache, or in his case, the weird patchy beard. Um, whereas Ultima is sort of traditionally female. She's the life bringer. She's the life giver. Um, Antonio's mother cooks and cleans and takes care of the household. These are familiar stereotypical gender roles, especially in rural environments. But here we get one that isn't, saying that uh, some of Antonio's doubts relating to God and traditional Christianity relate to God being too much like a man, that only women can forgive in the way that he's expecting here. Um, and it also works symbolically if the religion that Ultima represents um, is perhaps the more convincing religion at times for Antonio in the novel. That her femininity in relation to that religion represents a contrast to the god of the Catholicism practiced in the village, and how uh, the masculinity of that god doesn't compare favorably. Um, Completely different passage now, but on the same page. We learn from Antonio. He says, "My uncles were farmers, men who took their only truth from the earth." We learn a lot about the Lunas being farmers, and how he's even sent in this section toward the end of the novel to spend the summer with them and learn the ways of farmers. But here we get interesting language. They're men who take their only truth from the earth. And I wonder how you view this truth within the text, or how the characters view this truth within the text. Um, if they take their only truth from the earth, what other truths are they not engaging in? Compared to, say, Antonio's father, who is not a farmer and has other truths. His truth seems tied to the Llano. And Antonio's truth, uh, through most of the novel, seems to be a search for truth, but not tied exclusively to the truth of farming. And of course, this harkens back to Winesburg, Ohio. Um, is the fact that the farmers in this novel take their only truth, their single truth, from the earth, does this make them a grotesque, or are we working outside of the realm of the grotesque here? Because remember, grotesques in Weinsberg are not necessarily ugly or uh, offensive. Just people who have become rigid in their worldview by clinging to a single truth. Are these farmers rigid in their worldview? And in the same chapter, while Antonio and some of his family are visiting the Lunas, we get the continuing story of Tenorio. That after the death of his first daughter, when he brings her to be buried in the church. And remember how important it is for the church's blessing and the appearance of being accepted by the church in this village. Um, the church rejects the burial of his daughter, and he rides into town with her casket, um, specifically to seek burial through the Catholic Church in holy ground. And we get this passage when they say no. It says, "But Tenorio was beaten. The entire village was witness to the excommunication." And I want you to think about, why is it important? Not just that he was excommunicated, that his daughter was denied burial. That affects Tenorio and is between him and the church. But why is it important that the village stands in witness to this? And think about what that says about the rural experience. That really, the sort of completing component of this loss, this excommunication, this defeat of Tenorio, is that the village sees it happen. Um, and I think this suggests many things about rural existence, but one is that decisions about people in the rural are often made by the community at large. Not formally, not like laws are passed, but once someone crosses the norms or crosses the expectations of a rural culture, it is much easier for that culture to shun them, or in this case, through the church, to excommunicate them. Whereas in a larger rural setting, we would assume that existence can still sort of be had because a lot of people don't know who you are. Here, as the village stands witness, that is not really a possibility. And in an ironic sort of way, the village drives Tenorio further toward his revenge, because what other option does he have? And in chapter 14, changing gears again, we get a passage that I would argue is central in some ways to the novel, but perhaps even more so to our evolving and growing concept of the rural. We've talked in Weinsberg specifically about how, as the town has changed, certain characters have felt sort of left out. That George Willard had to leave because there ultimately was nothing still there for him. That Jesse Bentley was a man out of time. And even in Ethan Frome, one of the reasons that Ethan struggles financially is because the sort of way of farming has started to pass him by and he can't keep up. So here we get Antonio. I think he's talking to Andrew, but he sort of looks back at the house as they're walking away. And he starts to say to Andrew what's on his mind, and he stops, and we sort of get his dialogue followed by what he can't say presented in narration. So it says, he says to Andrew, "Sometimes I get the feeling that I will come home and it will all be changed. It won't be the same anymore." And then he stops speaking, and the narration finishes the thought for him. "I could not tell him that I wanted the castle of the giants to stand forever, that I wanted the goat path and the hill to be for always. But I had misgivings. I was beginning to learn that things wouldn't always be the same." Clearly significant to the story that as Antonio grows up, things change and he can't resist that. But isn't this also the truth of the rural that we have seen already and that we will continue to see even in more explicit detail as we continue reading our texts? That there is this rose-colored ideal of the rural, sort of the lovely, quaint, small town that we see in Weinsberg, for example, that it's very hard to actually get in a vehicle and drive out and find anymore. That often the American idea of the small town is an idea that only exists in memory. And as much as we don't want to have lost it, it is gone. You can't go to Weinsberg, Ohio anymore. Even if it were real, the Weinsberg that you could go to would not be the one from the book. Even if you go to a small town in New Mexico, it will not be governed by the society and the structures that the one in Bless Me Ultima is. These things pass. And that loss in rural communities specifically is more profound because rural communities often can't actively change. Cities can often adapt to new technologies and new industries much faster. Most small towns are rooted largely in socioeconomic factors of the past. That's why so many small towns, for example, in southern Indiana, are struggling because coal mines are drying up, farms are becoming corporately owned, and what comes in to replace that? Occasionally you'll have something. There are a few towns in Indiana that have a great tax base because of industrial work and factory. work, but not many. And towns suffer. They don't want to change, but they do. And it's even more painful because rural communities are based on tradition and history in ways that many other cultures often are not, because they're either newer or more familiar with change. And in chapter 15, we get another passage. Um, so Tenorio kills Narciso, and Antonio's the only one that sees it. Tenorio sort of disappears. No one else sees that he has done it. They find Narciso's body, but when Antonio tells the story of what happened to the authorities, it says, quote, "The coroner's jury that gathered under the juniper tree found the cause of death to be accidental or self-inflicted. Then they hurried away from the cold to the warmth of their homes. Because Narciso was the town drunk, nobody cared much." So, plot wise, it has to happen this way so that Antonio can ask the question of why did Narciso die and why does Tenorio not get punished for it? Um, but what does this also reveal about small town culture? This is, I would say, maybe the dark side of small town life. Um, Things that are uncomfortable, things that are deemed to not be worth the time, are swept under the rug in ways that they couldn't be in larger, more bureaucratic places. Here, these are just men who come out and do this. They go back home. They don't want to deal with it. Narciso's just the town drunk. He's clearly managed to get himself killed, and they're not too concerned with why, because he is just the town drunk. Um, there is a great strength, I think, in rural culture being able to police itself, but there's also danger there, and this is an example of that danger. Also in chapter 15, we get a conversation between Antonio and Ultima. It's sort of summarized. And one of the things that comes up, and at this point in the book, many things are coming up in these conversations. But in this conversation, Antonio tells us that the old people, Ultima said, always helped each other. This is a memory of sort of the current old people that include Ultima and then sort of the people of the past here in this community. Through good and bad, good or bad, they stuck together. And the friendships that were formed in the desolate Llano were bonds for life. Um, why might these bonds be particularly strong? Because bonds for life are never common. And how might the rural be involved? In other words, why does the fact that this culture exists on the border of or on the desolate Llano affect um, the fact that these bonds are so tight? I mean, one obvious answer is because they only have each other. In a larger, more populated community, you can sort of let people go and move on to other people. It's very hard to do in small towns and rural locations. Unless people move in, unless people move out, you sort of have the people that you have. And your relationships can become very complex and they can change over time, but it's very hard to turn your back completely on someone. I don't think that's the only answer to this question, and I would challenge you to consider other answers, but I think that would be one. Bless Me Ultimate is a novel that exists, I think, to some extent, at least it feels that it exists largely outside of modern culture and outside of familiar, sort of broader American culture. I think one of the reasons is that it deals with a subculture that is less familiar to us, that is very insular, that doesn't have um, a lot of give and take with broader mid-century white American culture. Um, and I also think that because it sort of has a wistful, nostalgic quality, it often feels as if it takes place earlier than it does. If it weren't for cars and the fact that we know World War II is going on, I think it would be very easy to assume that the novel takes place much earlier, which again does relate to the rural. If you happen to grow up in a rural place, you know that as we've already said in this presentation, things change slowly, if at all. And I remember music and fashion trends and things like that when I grew up in a rural place tended to come 5 to 10 years later than most major urban areas in the country. Certainly, I remember people were tight rolling their jeans at the school I went to long after that would have been very untrendy in New York or LA. But in chapter 17, we get a rare glimpse, I think, into how even in this small village, the family of Antonio and the people that he knows are aware of the larger world outside of them. And in this case, it's because the United States government has started testing atom bombs fairly near this village. The desert southwest of the United States is where the first atom bomb tests took place. Um, New Mexico, I think possibly Arizona, um, and some of those sorts of places. And the people of this community who live close enough to know that it's happening. I don't think it's like in their backyard. They don't see mushroom clouds necessarily, but they have heard about what's going on. And in the description of how this community views the atom bomb tests, we hear this: they compete with God. They disturb the seasons. They seek to know more than God Himself. In the end, that knowledge they seek will destroy us all. There's a deceptive amount of stuff going on in such a short two sentences. What does this passage tell us about rural attitudes toward technology, toward change, toward the ongoing war, and the politics related to it? It presents a very us versus them dichotomy, for one. They don't see themselves, even if they are Americans, as the people testing these bombs. Um, they seem doubtful, which makes sense because this is a community that doesn't have a lot of use for cutting edge technology. I'm not even certain that there is electricity in Antonio's house. And of course, they embody the rural mindset that change is generally dangerous, something to be suspicious of, something to be doubtful of. Um, and the war, as we've already learned, was traumatic in this town because it kept taking their sons away. So the atom bomb, as a symbol of the war, is also doubted again. And while we're in chapter 17, we also get what I guess would be considered more commentary, not quite as specific as on the atom bomb, but we get a description of how things have changed. And this sets it up as sort of a tension between people and their environment. But as I read this, think back to Ethan Frome. Think back to Sarah Orna Jewett's story. Think back to Weinsberg, and see if we see a thread continuing through these stories. The rich rancheros sucked the earth dry with their deep wells. Rancheros is just ranchers. And so the heavy snows had to come to replenish the water in the earth. The greedy men overgrazed their ranches. And so now the wind picks up the barren soil and throws it in their faces. You have used me too much, the wind says for the earth. You have sucked me dry and stripped me bare. So, what does this passage tell us about development, industrial development in this place? Well, it tells us that it's been happening at a brisk pace, and that the people who actually live here, not the people who come here and develop, but the people who have stayed here, see it as largely destructive and dangerous and not at all in harmony with the natural world. And what does it tell us about the place itself? And I think maybe this is where it stands out as a little different than Weinsberg and some of these other stories, is this passage implies that the place itself will take care of itself. That as the deep wells are dug, the place sends the heavy snows to replenish the water. As the grass is overgrazed, the wind picks up the barren soil and throws it in their faces in response. There is agency in the land here, in this story, that we haven't necessarily seen in Weinsberg or in Ethan Frome. Yes, we get a sense in those books that overdevelopment and sort of industrial developers coming in and taking over things cause problems. Um, but that is done to a fairly passive land and to a fairly passive citizenry in those stories. Here, the citizenry is still passive. There's nothing Antonio and his parents can do about these things happening. But the land seems to want to take care of itself. And I think that relates to a lot of things. It relates certainly to the more indigenous religions and beliefs that are practiced in this place. If you can have a golden carp that is a god in fish form, then the natural world here certainly has power that we didn't see in those other texts. So this passage draws comparisons to everything we've read so far, in that there is a possibility that people who get greedy and get pushy spoil the natural world of the rural. Here, however, we have at least a sense that that world is capable of pushing back. So I don't actually have a passage to look at on this slide in chapter 18. Um, it's a very memorable scene. As they're waiting to go in for their first confession, the kids start to play the game. Let's play confession. And since they recognize Antonio as sort of the most serious and well read and sort of interested in religion of them all, they tell him to pretend to be the priest and listen to everybody's confession. Antonio, because he does take his faith seriously, resists this, but he ends up playing along, and everybody sort of gives their confessions of, peeking through into the girls' bathroom or whatever. And when we get to Florence, who outwardly refuses to believe in sort of the traditional Catholicism of this town, um, they get very upset and they ask Antonio to give Florence a penance, give him a punishment for not believing. And Antonio gets really uncomfortable with that. One, because he doesn't think he should be impersonating a priest, but two, because he tends to be pretty thoughtful and compassionate toward everyone, believer or not. When he says no, he won't do that. Uh, all of the other kids, who honestly have been sort of silly but very much kid like through most of the story, suddenly get sort of inexplicably violent and sort of beat up Antonio. They tear his clothes off, they kick him, they scratch him. And as you were reading, I suspect you had the reaction that I had the first time I read this novel, which is, what is going on here? Why has everyone gone crazy? And on the level of reality, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, this is a novel that isn't always interested in reality, which is why we have golden carps, which is why we have curses and witches and these sorts of things. But you should always ask yourself, how else can I read a scene besides just, why are these characters doing what they're doing on the level of character? And in this case, I think there are other ways to read this scene symbolically. And I've got my bullet point here, representative of Christ, question mark. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about what Antonio does, he steps in, he intercedes for someone who is, at least in the eyes of these kids, guilty of something. Florence is a sinner, he is not a believer. And when they say to Antonio, who is standing in as the priest, and what is a priest if not also a symbol of the biblical Christ, um, that you need to punish him, and he says no, and instead Antonio himself takes on the punishment of the children. Isn't Antonio becoming sort of the symbolic Christ in this story, or in this moment in the story? He is saying, yes, Florence deserves punishment, but I am not going to give it to him. And so instead, he is punished. Antonio is not crucified the way Christ was in the New Testament, but he takes on the punishment that is actually deserved by others. Now, of course, this is complicated because the text, the narrative, doesn't want to condemn Florence. In fact, he seems to know in some ways more what he's talking about than the other kids. But for Antonio, who is trying to figure out religion and faith, there's this lovely moment where he actually comes to embody it before he even understands it. He's actually very disappointed when he goes in and takes communion, because God doesn't talk to him once he swallows him, right? And yet, Antonio has come to represent the sort of most noble parts of traditional Christianity in this scene, despite the fact that he's later disappointed that it's not being communicated effectively to him. I don't know that that's a completely satisfying reading of this scene. It still is a strangely violent and sort of jarring scene, but I think it gives you a way of understanding it, as a sort of unexpectedly symbolic step on Antonio's continued path of trying to make sense of faith and belief and religion. And as the book sort of moves towards its resolution, its denouement, its ending, we get in chapter 22. Um, we get a fairly involved conversation as Antonio's father is taking him to the Lunas to spend the summer. Antonio's father doesn't say a lot in this novel generally. We have a sense of what he believes and feels. We know that he's disappointed that his sons don't want to go to California. We know that he was a vaquero of the Llano and that he isn't one to be tied down. He's restless. But he plays a much less direct role in Anthony's development than Ultima and Antonio's mother. But in this drive, we get a conversation where Antonio has gotten to where he's just really interested in sort of metaphysical concepts, the nature of good and evil, why bad things happen to good people, why bad people are allowed to escape in the case of Tenorio. And good and evil comes up. At first, Antonio's father sort of brushes it off, and then when he realizes that Antonio wants uh, an answer, he gives a fairly sustained answer. And we're not going to talk about all of it here, but we get this really interesting moment. Um, and it's on the same page, although not together. Sort of midway through page 248, Antonio's father says, "We fear evil only because we do not understand it." In other words, we call things evil because we don't know how to make sense of them, and the unknown is frightening to us, so we often label it as undesirable, as evil. But shortly thereafter, toward the bottom of the page, Antonio's father says this: "In the end, understanding simply means having a sympathy for people." Now, Antonio's father doesn't make the connection between these two statements, but we can. If we call things evil because we don't understand them, but understanding something means having sympathy for people, then is the implication here that sympathy leads to sort of the removal or the destruction of evil? And if so, how does that inform this novel? And to some extent, how does it inform or offer a criticism of the rural? Um, Rural cultures, because they're very insular, because they're very homogenous, often look at people different than them and say, that's bad, that's wrong. Not all rural people, but the cultures as a whole will sometimes do that. Um, and yet the implication here seems to be that if people and cultures can move past reflexively being doubtful of things they see as different, and instead offer understanding, that that fear that comes along with evil uh, will may perhaps be taken away. Um, that's what Antonio's father seems to be implying here. Now, as you read how the novel unfolds, you have to decide if that is wisdom for Antonio or if that is one possibility that maybe doesn't pan out. But I think it does offer some commentary on rural culture and rural experience either way. Um, in some ways, rural cultures are the most welcoming, inviting cultures that you can find in the United States. But there are certain situations where they are very insular. Um, Through generations of really things not changing in the same families and the same lineages being there, they are or can be somewhat distrustful of outsiders. And so the climax of the novel comes. Tenorio successfully kills Ultima's owl uh, because we are sort of told Ultima's spirit resides in the owl. Ultima herself dies as a result of the owl dying, and uh, everyone's very sad. Antonio has to come to grips with this. Um, you can sort of grasp and comprehend the plot yourself. You don't need me to sort of make sense of that for you. But there is a very short sentence. Once again, I'm a strong believer that deeper meaning and thematic meaning in these texts can often be found in short, almost throwaway feeling passages and sentences. And here, almost at the end, Antonio says, and this definitely has a sort of retrospective narrator feel to it. This is really adult Antonio talking about remembering what happened at the end of this book. He says, "Sometime in the future, I would have to build my own dream out of those things that were so much a part of my childhood." And I would argue that coming as it does at the end of the book, this statement may serve as a summary of the book. So, what is the comment here on, say, coming of age? Because this is a coming of age novel. That perhaps we have to become adults by piecing together the things we learn as a child. And childhood is an important part of becoming an adult. How does it comment on the rural? Right? That if there is a new way for rural culture to survive and adapt, perhaps it is not by turning its back on tradition and all of the older cultural artifacts of the rural culture, but by building on them and synthesizing sort of new existence out of them. For example, I mean, as a very practical example, if you have a small town where the coal mines have dried up and the farms have been bought up, well, how do you keep that community going? Do you do it by completely changing the kind of work you expect people to do here, or do you do it by embracing the fact that rural cultures are often based on blue collar labor and simply look for new ways to do that? See how those are two different things? Um, and I think to some extent, this is also a comment on something that has been a thread through this entire novel, which is not just the fact that change happens. And that is resisted both by Antonio as a character and by rural cultures more generally. But here, the implication seems to be that it is a necessity. The only way that adult Antonio builds a dream is out of the things that were a part of his childhood, past tense, but that have, out of necessity, changed. In other words, Antonio can only become an adult because things change. If they didn't, he would be a perpetual child. There would be no learning, there would be no building on his experience. And I think the same thing is often true of the rural. That successful rural communities find ways to grow out of or through changes that happen. Whether it's very practically different kinds of work, or even the harder to define aspects of rural culture about beliefs and traditions and how those change but grow out of what is originally there. So clearly, this is a novel about more than just this, but I feel like if you're looking for a passage to sort of bring it to a close and sum up our 2 week study of Bless Me Ultima, this is definitely a possibility. I would love maybe to hear in the threads about which ones you find other than this. But thank you very much for making it to the end of Bless Me Ultima. I think it's a great novel. I think it's an unusual novel. It's really not like anything else that we'll read in this class. It offers an insight into a culture that we haven't seen elsewhere and probably really won't see again. But I think that culture is still of a piece and representative of the larger rural experience we're studying. So thank you very much. Have a great week, and we will come back next week to start reading Toni Morrison's Sula.